by saving a few percent off your living expenses, having your emergency fund earn a few extra percent, saving a few percent on your taxes for money that's going to grow a few percent every year until you retire. These things, when combined, really start to add up and let you get to a place where you have enough money that you have more financial stability and more flexibility to do the things you want. And really, a lot of it comes from having enough of an emergency fund saved up that you can do these sorts of strategies.
Welcome to the Personal Finance for PhDs podcast, a higher education in personal finance. This podcast is for PhDs and PhDs-to-be who want to explore the hidden curriculum of finances to learn the best practices for money management, career advancement, and advocacy for yourself and others. I'm your host, Dr. Emily Roberts, a financial educator specializing in early career PhDs and founder of Personal Finance for PhDs. This is Season 20, Episode 3, and today my guest is Kyle Smith, a sixth-year graduate student at Penn State. Kyle and I go deep on the financial strategies and hacks he's used during grad school to increase his income and optimize how he spends and manages his money. In addition to side hustles and credit card and banking bonuses, we discuss how graduate students can benefit from using 529s and 457Bs in a unique way. Kyle's message is that finding ways to spend a few percentage points less on much or all of your expenses really adds up over time to confer financial security in the present and increase wealth in the long term. The tax year 2024 version of my tax return preparation workshop, How to Complete Your PhD Trainee Tax Return and Understand It Too, is now available. This pre-recorded educational workshop explains how to identify, calculate, and report your higher education-related income and expenses on your federal tax return. Whether you are a graduate student, postdoc, or postbac, domestic or international, there is a version of this workshop designed just for you. While I do sell these workshops to individuals, I prefer to license them to universities so that the graduate students, postdocs, and postbacs can access them for free. Would you please reach out to your graduate school, graduate student government, postdoc office, international house, fellowship coordinator, etc., to request that they sponsor this workshop for you and your peers? You can find more information about licensing these workshops at pfforphds.com/tax-workshops. Please pass that page on to the potential sponsor. Thank you so much for doing so. You can find the show notes for this episode at pfforphds.com/S20E3. Without further ado, here's my interview with Kyle Smith. I am delighted to have joining me on the podcast today, Kyle Smith. He's a sixth-year graduate student at Penn State, and we are going to talk about, well, I'm going to reference the title of another podcast to listen to, All the Hacks. We're going to talk about numerous different kind of financial hacks that Kyle has used throughout graduate school to increase his income, decrease some expenses, optimize finances in a few different ways. And Kyle's been at it for several years, so he has a lot to share with us, some very unique strategies that we hardly ever touch on in the course of the podcast. So you're definitely going to hear some new stuff today. Kyle, thank you so much for volunteering to come on the podcast. And will you please introduce yourself a little bit further for the listeners?
Yeah, my name's Kyle Smith. I'm a sixth-year graduate student at Penn State, like you said. I got first introduced to your podcast right before I was starting graduate school. So I've been able to learn from some of your tips over the years. My research, I'm in the anthropology department, looking at dog-human interaction. So for my research, I've gotten to go to the dog park and watch people's dogs and study how they think and interact with people, which has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, that does sound like fun. Okay. We are going to, as I said, talk about some different financial hacks that graduate students may be able to apply in their own lives. But before we get into your list that you sent me, I wanted to know, why have you pursued all of these and kept going with, some of them that worked out? Like, why not just take your stipend and work with it as is and not put in the effort to find these extra, extra workarounds. So tell us about that motivation.
Yeah, I suppose really kind of my whole life I've just been more of the saver sort of mentality. Just whatever money I got, I would usually just save it up. I think I tend to have less expenses that I want to spend money on compared to a lot of people. So I've just tried to, just kind of accumulate enough excess that I have the flexibility that when there is something then that I want to spend the money on, that I have enough of a buffer to do so. So really, I've been just kind of trying to optimize things to just accumulate a little bit more, focusing a lot on retirement and especially saving for retirement in a way that gives the flexibility with what to do with that money, which we'll get into in a little bit later. And just realizing that, any money that you're saving up now and investing for the future will be worth a lot more later. So, if you're fine to do a few things to save on some of your expenses, that really adds up over time.
Absolutely. And I do want to point out that in the list that you sent me, there really isn't too much about what I would call like true frugality. We're actually not talking about decreasing expenses in terms of like giving up quality or downsizing or anything like that. We're really going to be talking about earning more or like financial type ways to spend less without getting less. Is that a fair way to characterize the list?
Yeah, I would say so with the things I mentioned. I mean, I definitely do, try to, spend less money on, don't eat out super often, split living expenses with people, never lived solo. So, there's strategies like that that have saved some money. But yeah, a lot of the things I just try to figure out ways where if I have a recurring expense, I can save a few percent on it. If I have some money sitting there, I can get a few extra percent on it. I'm finding that those really add up over time.
Yeah, and I especially want to point this out for like the listeners who have felt like they've maxed out on spending less. Like I'm doing everything already that I can to spend less and I'm not interested in cutting any further. How can I earn more or optimize more to, free up more money for my goals, right? So that's really what we're talking about today. Okay, so let's jump into your list. The first thing you told me is that you volunteer for research studies. Tell me about that and how much you're earning from it.
Yeah, it's been a while since I've done any of those. But when you're on campus in a university, you can walk around the hallways and see there's, signs sometimes where they have looking for research participants. So a lot of times I'll just pay attention to that and follow up with that if it seems like something that's worth pursuing. Plenty of studies are kind of short and you can make a quick $20, or some are a little more involved, but you can make hundreds over time. So there was one in particular that I got quite a bit from because they were doing a longitudinal study of graduate students that started my first year of graduate school. So there were kind of recurring surveys that they would have you do. They'd have you come in sometimes for some in-person sampling, such as like cutting your hair to look at your cortisol and stuff like that. So I saved up a few hundreds of dollars through studies like that. There was one I did where did an MRI scan of my brain that they also pay you a little bit higher for because you're in a cramped box. So yeah, just looking out for opportunities like that allow you to sometimes save just a little bit extra money here or there. And then if you have a strategy where you're trying to save anything extra for retirement or for the long term instead of getting an extra $20 and immediately spending it, then that really adds up over time.
Either way, whatever you want to do with it, it's your extra $20 here or there. I mean, like you said, in any sort of large research university, there's going to be studies like that. I think one of the other bonuses is that sometimes they're actually pretty interesting to participate in. Like you actually learn something about yourself or about the study or what have you. Have you found that to be the case?
Oh, definitely. It's been interesting just getting to see a different side to research from the research that I'm doing and the research that I read about, but actually being a participant in it can be pretty interesting sometimes, especially when you see connections with like what you're doing. Like I had look at the hair cortisol of the dogs and I was giving my hair for the hair cortisol. There was actually a study I did when I was an undergrad. I volunteered and they, as part of it, took my DNA and I got my 23andMe results back in addition to getting paid for doing it. So that was an interesting thing.
Definitely. Wow. Gotcha. Okay. Next item on your list was a side hustle, a true side hustle. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, this was kind of funny because it was just came out of nowhere. I got an email in my inbox one day saying that the person was a Chinese academic who was looking for American students to help edit manuscripts by Chinese academics, and asking if I was interested. And I immediately thought that it looked like some sort of scam phishing email. There was a strange address. People offering you money that you've never heard of before is usually something to be a little wary of. But it seemed, I thought about it and I was like, well, it might be legit. So I tried to look up the person and looked up his papers. I found that people in the acknowledgments had been thanked for helping translate. So I actually reached out to those people before him and was just, is this guy legit? And they told me they'd worked with him and had good experiences. Yeah, so that was just kind of an occasional thing. Sometimes I would do a few of these in a month. Sometimes they didn't offer me any for a while. But yeah, just he seemed to have some connections to other researchers and tries to reach out to Americans to help just edit the English. I've done a handful of those over the past few years. They usually paid around $150 to $200 per manuscript, depending on how long it was.
That's an amazing pay rate.
Yeah, no, that's been a good way to. It's not a reliable enough thing that I can count on that as predictable income, but just occasionally they reach out and they're like, "Hey, can you do this paper?"
I really like this type of side hustle that just opportunities come your way, and depending on your schedule and your availability, you can just say yes or no. And that's great. It's nice to not be committed to something when you go through busier periods as a graduate student.
Yeah, whenever they've reached out about editing these, they've asked first if I'm available before sending it, and there were a couple times where I'm like, "No, sorry, I'm too busy this week."
Absolutely. Okay. Next item on your list is kind of a bigger one. Credit card and banking bonuses. Tell us about your strategies here.
Yeah, there's a few websites out there that accumulate these sorts of things. Doctor of Credit is one where they have bank bonuses and credit card bonuses that are being offered at that time. Sometimes you get some in the mail, so it's worth checking your junk mail about these. And a lot of times, different banks will or credit cards will offer you like a couple $100s if you sign up for a bank account or open a credit card with them and spend X amount of money in the first certain amount of time. And in many cases, these can be fairly profitable ways with not that much effort. Usually there's some sort of requirements attached to it, so you have to pay attention to those and carefully note down what the requirements are and if you can meet those and that you're not going to be incurring more expenses than you're getting back. But for instance, a lot of banks, they'll say like $200 if you direct deposit at least $1,000. So I just update my direct deposit for that month, have my next paycheck go into there and then change it back after that. And if there's not ongoing fees for maintaining it, then that's sometimes just an easy way to get some money.
Okay, yeah, let's pause a little bit on the banking bonuses. So you just gave one example of like, oh, I just had to update my direct deposit to go to a different place. Sometimes you might have to keep that up for a few months, I think, for some offers like this. Or other ones I've heard of, you have to keep like a certain balance in the account for a certain amount of time. So I'm wondering if you have done anything like that. Have you had to move like a chunk of money somewhere and kept it there to get a bonus?
Yeah, there's sometimes little requirements like that. Sometimes there's a minimum bonus for a certain amount of time. Um, some of these, when you run the math, it doesn't really make sense to do. But others, I can keep 1,000 there for 3 months and get a few $100s out of it, assuming you've got enough money saved up that you have some flexibility there. It's a strategy that makes more sense if you've got enough of an emergency fund that you have a few extra $1,000s to spare. Some of them require a certain amount of transactions. Um, there's oftentimes easy ways around this. You can like set up your main account to just transfer $10 in and take it out automatically if you need to have a certain transaction each month in order to not have a fee. Some of them are tied to like use your debit card, 20 times in the first month, and I just go to the gas station and buy $1 of gas, buy $1 of gas, buy $1 of gas just in a row. So there's ways to trigger it. And if you look on sites like Doctor of Credit, they usually detail what these are.
That's so interesting. I hadn't heard about those little strategies just to fulfill that requirement like very quickly. That's very helpful to not have to like think about it over a long period of time and remember, oh, I'm supposed to be using this card versus like this one to do this
Yeah, I
thing.
think the way they get you with these things is they're hoping that it'll be too much for you to do all that, so they either won't have to pay the bonus because you trip up, or that you just you're not paying enough attention and then you start accumulating some monthly fee because you weren't doing their one transaction a month or whatever.
So you just have to be really organized.
Yeah, you
Yeah.
just have to be really organized, pay attention to what exactly the rules are, and just make sure you're following those to a T.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's take like a credit card example then, since we just talked about bank accounts. Now, when I was in graduate school, it was quite a while ago, so credit card offers were different than they are now. I know I was always concerned about being able to reach those sign up bonuses, like spend one, two, three, six, whatever it is, $1,000 over 2 to 4 months. These kinds of things are common. And I don't think in graduate school I ever paid an annual fee for a credit card. I do now, but that was something I was just sort of like, the whole category, I was just like against it at the time, right? So like tell us about that. Like how do you balance knowing that you're going to be able to meet these sign up bonuses? Do you have any tricks about, spending or timing the spending or whatever? And also, yeah, how do you weigh the pros and cons if there are some costs associated with it?
Yeah. I just try to pay attention to what my actual level of spending is and what the requirements are. And if there's something where I don't think I can meet the requirements, won't do it. I don't have as many credit cards as some people who really pursue the strategy. But there's some that are quite easy to meet, like some of the ones from Chase tend to be some of the most sought after ones. And you can only get a certain number of credit cards per often before your credit score starts to go down and you start getting rejected. But some of the Chase ones, you have to spend $500 in the first 3 months and you get $200 or something like that. And that's easy enough for most people to do if they put all the groceries on it for a few months. There's some that have had bigger amounts. So some of the Chase ones are more lucrative where you can get $1,000 sign up bonus or so. The amount fluctuates. So you have to look at the time, but you have to spend $4,000 in 3 months. And I don't spend that much in that amount of time, especially because you're not paying the rent on the credit card typically. But there are strategies that you can do. And I think you'd only want to do this if you're the kind of person who knows that you're going to specifically be doing the math to spend the right amount to make it worth it for you, instead of just spending a bunch of money and thinking, oh, I'm saving money because I get a bonus. So what I've done you have to spend like a larger amount of money, getting 1,000 back on 4,000 spending is still worth it if you can make it work. So what I've done is just put everything that I can on it during that time. And then when it gets closer to the deadline, there's various grocery stores and pharmacies sell these $500 prepaid debit cards with about a $5 fee, which normally doesn't make any financial sense. But if you're getting essentially 25% back, then you can put the last couple $1,000s of that on these prepaid cards and then just use those for your expenses for the next few months. So you can kind of preload your spending of that amount and let it stretch over your expenses for many more months. I've also, paired this for if I know I'm going to be booking some flights for the holidays or some other expenses. So when the timing of when you get these cards can matter a bit too.
Yeah, so not only for either one of these strategies, you have to stay very organized. You also have to really know your budget. You have to know what your spending is going to be over the next, 3 or 6 months or whatever, so that you can understand, yes, I'm going to have enough spending, or I'm not quite going to have enough. So as you said at the end, I'm going to be able to use this strategy. But prepaying, by buying gift cards or whatever, debit cards, that requires you to have that money up front. So another area where we talked about like getting that first, $1,000, $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 in like an emergency fund or just a general savings fund is so, so helpful to actually help you generate even more side hustle money. Like you're really putting your money to work for you. Now, we're all, of course, hoping that an emergency wouldn't come your way in that time when you have some money tied up in a debit card or whatever. But anyway, it gives you more flexibility. So it's just something that like builds on itself. So if you get that first 1,000, like then maybe the next, few hundred is easier to come by because you can use some of these like tricks and hacks.
For sure.
And you also were just telling me that you paired this strategy with paying estimated tax on your fellowship. Can you tell us what that strategy was when you were using it?
Yeah, so if you've not been listening to this podcast as much and you're not aware of the estimated taxes, sometimes if you're on a fellowship, they're not withholding your income tax and you're responsible for paying that several times a year. I was on a fellowship like this my first year of graduate school. Some people are on it if they have the GRFP for 3 years, depends on your situation. And they let you pay these payments either straight from your bank account or you can pay it with a debit card for like a $2 or so fee, I think it is. So again, if you're able to buy these prepaid debit cards in such a way that you're earning a decent percent back, and then you can use that to pay your prepaid taxes for a small fee, you do the math and see if it works out in your favor. But especially if you're getting a big bonus or if you have a big percent back on that credit card, then it can end up saving you quite a bit more money than you're spending in the fee. Um, there's some credit cards too have like different rotating benefits. Like I have one that has a category that changes 4 times a year. Sometimes they are giving you a bunch of money back for PayPal, and they also normally give you money back for a pharmacy, and those stack on top of each other. So if I can get 7% back at a pharmacy by buying a prepaid card and then use that for my taxes that they immediately refund to me, that saves you a decent bit of money. The last time I tried that, they didn't let me buy the prepaid card with the credit card at the pharmacy, or with PayPal anyway. So you have to, your mileage may vary, as they say, and the kind of rules for these things are changing all the time. But if you look at sites related to, people who are doing these sorts of strategies, you can kind of find out to some extent what works and doesn't at that time.
Yeah, all the like buying of gift cards, buying of prepaid debit cards, those kind of ways to get up to those minimum spends. It's a common suggestion, but the routes to doing it oftentimes get shut down. It makes sense that these things don't always work in perpetuity, but as you said, there are resources available where you can learn how to pivot.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, is there anything else you want to add about the credit card or the banking bonuses?
One thing with regards to the banking is, another strategy is not just the sign up bonuses, but banks that are going to give you a certain amount of interest on what you have in that account. Most banks tend to give you very low percentages these days, but you can sometimes find some that give you a few percent back. I have most of my money in an account offered through Vanguard called Cash Plus, that gives, I think, 3 or 4% uh, per year of what you have in there as interest. It's kind of a clunky account. It seems like it's not as made to interface very well with other banks. So there's been some frustrations with using that. But if you have thousands of dollars saved up as an emergency fund and you can get 4% of that back every year, you might as well park that money in an account where it's going to be giving you a decent percentage back. And that just goes back to the whole theme of trying to optimize your finances by a few percent here or there, especially in the long term.
Emily here for a brief interlude. Tax season is in full swing, and the best place to go for information tailored to you as a graduate student, postdoc, or postbac is pfforphds.com/tax. From that page, I have linked to all of my free tax resources, many of which I have updated for this tax year. On that page, you'll find podcast episodes, videos, and articles on all kinds of tax topics relevant to PhDs and PhDs to be. There are also opportunities to join the Personal Finance for PhDs mailing list to receive PDF summaries and spreadsheets that you can work with. Again, you can find all of these free resources linked from pfforphds.com/tax. Now back to the interview. Okay, now we're going to get into the strategies that I'm really excited about. So the first one is a 529 strategy. So Kyle, tell us, what is a 529? Why would a graduate student be using one? How are you using it in a way that's very different from how it's like advertised?
So a 529 plan is something that was created to help incentivize parents to save money for their kids' college. If you're familiar with retirement accounts, it's kind of similar to that, where you're getting some tax benefits to be investing money for a long-term goal. But in this case, it's higher education. Like I said, the intention seems to be more about saving for your kids' college, but they have some flexibility about this. It doesn't have to be your child. It can be your grandkid or your spouse or even for yourself. And while the intention is that you're going for expenses farther down the road, usually the minimum amount of time it has to be in there seems to be about a week. And it's not just college that this works for. They let you use these funds for K through 12 education that has tuition and also for graduate school. So a lot of states have tax deductions for people who contribute to these plans because they're trying to incentivize people to invest in higher education. The idea is if you're a parent, you contribute, a few $1,000s each year, invest it, and then when you're taking that money out for your kids' education, you don't owe taxes on that after all the growth, and you've been saving some money on your state taxes along the way. What I've been doing is a tip I learned from your site years ago, where you create an account where you're both the account owner and the beneficiary. you contribute money to it, withdraw it a week later after the hold lifts, and then you can, if you're using those money for qualified educational expenses, you're allowed to deduct that from your state taxes. So the qualified educational expenses, you need to look up and make sure it works. But basically, it's room and board for a graduate student. It's tuition's allowed too, but since most graduate students aren't paying tuition, that's not as helpful. I believe you can also do a certain amount of student loan payments as well. So, I'll just every few months contribute some of my money into this account, withdraw it a week later, and then just keep track of how much I'm spending on food and rent, and then just kind of do this so that the amount that I've contributed and withdrawn is, as close as I can get it to the amount that I'm spending on room and board without going over it. And then when it comes time to pay my taxes in Pennsylvania, I can deduct, in theory, up to $19,000 of contributions from my taxes, assuming that that doesn't, go that I'm not using these for things that are other than the qualified educational expenses. And since the Pennsylvania income tax is 3.07%, that adds up over time. I think in total, I've saved about $2,000 on my state taxes over the years by doing this.
Wow. Okay. I can see now why you're being careful to keep track of how much you've actually spent in qualified education expenses. So I didn't know about Pennsylvania specifically, but some other states I've looked at, the benefit might be limited to like $5,000 or like a few $100s even. So with having such a high limit, then yeah, it really makes sense that you're trying to, as you said, get as close as you can to matching your actual qualified education expenses so you can try to deduct as much as possible for that year. That may not be as much of a challenge in other states, is what I'm saying, because maybe your rent alone for a few months would already max out like that benefit. We're using the term qualified education expenses, which very, very astute listeners will know that when we talk about qualified education expenses, we always have to say what the benefit is that is defining that particular instance of qualified education expense. So qualified education expenses for 529 accounts, as you mentioned, include things like living expenses, room and board. It's defined, but qualified education expenses for other benefits are like only tuition and required fees and so forth. So just be sure that you're looking at the right definition, the right list when you're trying to figure out what your qualified education expenses are for 529s. So anyway, your particular benefit in Pennsylvania sounds incredible because that limit is so high. Other states, the limits will be different. Sometimes it's a credit, not a deduction. Some states don't have any benefit. And we are talking about a state level benefit, not a federal benefit. So the state that I live in, California, doesn't offer any tax incentives for contributions to 529s. So you may be stuck with a state that doesn't participate in this in any way, and then this isn't going to work for you. But if you live in a state with income tax, then you should certainly look up whether there is any 529 contribution benefit. And I'm just, struck by the fact this is another example where because you have freed up, 1,000, 2,000, whatever amount of money that you're able to move around and do these different things that, like these 529 contributions, you're able to then spend less, so much more money, like how that little bit of financial flexibility is buying you even more and more and more financial flexibility. So for those listening, I would just say, if you haven't saved that first $1, $2, $3, $4,000, like work on that hard, because then you can, these other ideas are then open to you after that point. That's so awesome. Now, I have been wondering about that residence time of like the money being in the account, because, in your case, like you don't want to contribute $19,000 and let it sit there for the whole year, right? You want to do small bits like frequently throughout the year. So how did you come to find out what the minimum time it had to spend in the account to qualify for this deduction?
I don't remember how I first found out, if it was somewhere in the documentation about opening it, or if I'd seen other people mentioning it. The one thing to note, like you said, the state laws vary quite a bit, so you just have to look up how it applies to you, if it does. But some states require it to be a specific plan from their state, and others let you do any 529 plan. Pennsylvania doesn't care what state it is, so I just did it through, I think, the Kansas plan, because I already had a Schwab bank account, and Schwab runs the Kansas plan. But there's others through Vanguard or whatever the case may be. So you need to make sure about that. But at least the one that I've done through Schwab, it just needs to be there for 1 week minimum. And like you said, I'm not going to put my entire living expenses for the year all in at the same time. But every month or two, if you just have enough money saved up for, the next month's living expenses, you can put it in the middle of the month, take it out, and by the time you're paying your bills at the start of the next month, it's still back there. So you want to have, some extra money saved up, but it doesn't need to be a ton.
Yes. Wow. What a powerful strategy. And so have you been doing this the whole time you've been in graduate school?
Yeah, I first heard of it, I think either in the beginning of graduate school or slightly before. So I've just been doing that the whole time. It saved me quite a bit of money on my state taxes.
Yeah, you said about $2,000. That's something like 400 per year, approximately, right?
Yeah, something like that. I got married last year. My spouse is also she was a graduate student. So once I was married, I started contributing for her expenses as well, which saved us a little bit extra. But yeah, if you're doing this in graduate school in Pennsylvania, saving 3% on all your rent and food expenses each year really adds up.
Yeah, it definitely does. Oh my gosh, I'm so grateful for this example. Thank you so much for sharing this with us.
One important thing to note with the 529 plans is because they're not really set up for people to be using it in the way that I've been using it, is you got to pay attention to certain details. Like in my account, I'm listed as both the account owner and the beneficiary. So you have to make sure that you are contributing as the account owner and removing money as the beneficiary, because it gives you the option to also remove it as the account owner, I guess, for people who contribute it and then decide that they didn't want to contribute it. But if you're removing it as the account owner, then they'll say that you're not actually contributing it. So then you won't get that tax benefit. So you just need to pay attention to that detail.
Yes, another example of where being organized and detail oriented is very necessary for making the strategy work. Okay, awesome. And then the last strategy you mentioned to me was about using a 457 retirement account, which is not one that gets a lot of airtime. So tell us what's different about this account. Why do you choose to use this either first or to supplement your other tax advantage retirement accounts?
Yeah, so I was working for a few years before I started graduate school. So I already had a Roth IRA and an account from my employer that I was contributing money and saving up that way. And then when I started graduate school, I was still contributing to the Roth IRA at first. But then I just think I got some letter in the mail just mentioning employee benefits that I had access to. And one of them was a supplemental retirement account. And I was like, what is that? So I looked it up. And something that a lot of graduate students encounter is that they're not eligible for most employer-sponsored retirement accounts. So they can't sign up for, a 401k and get their employer matching their contributions or anything like that. But I found in my case, this probably holds at some other universities as well, that there's something called a supplemental retirement account where they're like, we're not going to contribute any money to this as your employer, but you're allowed to put money into it. At first, this wouldn't seem like it has that much of an advantage compared to just your own IRA because you're managing that yourself. Why would you worry about involving your employer? But I noticed when I was reading the benefits that the 457B seems to have some really specific advantages that are actually quite nice and that I don't think you can really get through any other account that I'm aware of. So if you're not as familiar with retirement accounts, whether they're an individual retirement account, an IRA, or an employer-sponsored plan, there's usually two types, either Roth or traditional. So Roth, you're paying your taxes on your income now, and then contributing it to the account where it can grow without getting taxed on your dividends or anything when you're investing it. And then when you withdraw it, when you retire, you don't owe any tax on it. Traditional is the other way around, where you're saving on your taxes for what you contribute. You don't have to pay income tax on it. It grows without getting taxed on the dividends. And then when you withdraw it in retirement, you owe tax on it at that time. So there's two different strategies depending on whether you want to pay your taxes now or pay your taxes at retirement. And a lot of people seem to recommend the Roth accounts in situations where it actually doesn't really seem to make sense. The typical advice that you hear is, oh, if you're, a graduate student or somebody else with a relatively low income, you'll probably be earning more money in retirement or when you're older. So you might as well do the Roth now and save on your taxes because you'll owe more tax on it later. There's really no way of knowing exactly what your taxes will be in retirement because you don't know how policy will change and how your lifestyle will change. But let's say, for instance, you're in the 12% tax bracket now, and you're in the same one when you retire. Um, if you contribute to a Roth account, you're saving the 12%, or you're paying the 12% now, and then you withdraw that tax-free later. But if you're contributing to a traditional account, you're you're saving the 12% now, and then you owe tax when you retire. But if you're in the same tax bracket, the first chunk that you pull out goes to your standard deduction and you don't owe tax on it. The next chunk you pull out is in the 10% bracket. And then only after that do you owe the 12% tax on it. So your average tax rate will actually be probably lower than your marginal tax rate. So it's a little more advantageous in many circumstances to do traditional. One of the disadvantages with traditional as opposed to Roth is that money is tied up until you're 59 and a half, and you're not allowed to remove it early without owing both the income tax on it and also a 10% penalty. With Roth, one of the nice advantages is you can take that money out that you've contributed early without owing any penalties on it. That's only a contribution. It's not what it's grown from being invested. But the unique thing that I found out about the 457B plan is it kind of is the best of both worlds. You get the tax benefit now, which, like as I just laid out, is probably in most cases going to be saving you money on your taxes overall. But uniquely with it, you can actually withdraw the money you contribute before retirement age as long as you've separated from that employer. And as a graduate student, I'm not planning on being employed by Penn State for the rest of my life, just until I finish my PhD. And then after that point, I'll have access to that money should I want it. And I think that this is a really nice advantage because it's nice to have the flexibility. If years down the line I have a loved one who gets sick and I want to quit my job and, for a year or two live off of what I have saved up, I would be able to do that and I would just owe my income tax and not any extra fee. If I get to age 50 and decide I want to retire then instead of waiting until 59 and a half, if I have enough money, I could just go ahead and do that and use this account. So it gives you a lot more flexibility about how you want to use it. Yeah, this does get withheld from your paycheck, so you have to a month in advance go in and say how much you want withheld. I've kind of adopted a flexible approach about this, where I just look at my expenses and budget and how much money I have, and I'll be like, I have more money saved up than I need, so I'll make my contributions a little bit higher, or oh, I had an unexpected expense this month with car repairs or something, I'll make it lower. But I've been trying to save up through that, and I think on average contributed in the like 8,000 to 9,000 per year into this account, which is actually more than the space from an IRA.
Thank you so much for that thorough explanation. I totally agree. So because I think most Americans, if they have any kind of workplace-based retirement plan, it's going to be a 401k, or maybe if they're a federal employee or something, TSP. But a lot of people who are employed by nonprofits and also government agencies at whatever level might have access to a 403b and maybe also a 457 as you do. But because it's such a small kind of percentage of the population, this account doesn't get a lot of airtime, when retirement accounts are discussed. So you're exactly right that this benefit of being able to remove the money early without penalty is pretty unique. That is to say, without having a special circumstance, you can remove sometimes for education or stuff like buying a home, stuff like that. But without any reason, right? You just have access to it whenever you want it. You don't have to justify it. It is a really unique thing and especially attractive for people who are going for early retirement, or as you said, might just want to access a chunk of money for whatever reason, for special life circumstances or what have you. So it is really unique. It sounds to me like you are using this as your primary tax advantage retirement account, right? You're not using a Roth IRA or anything similar in addition.
Yeah, ever since I found out about this account, I've only contributed to that for retirement. I still have the Roth IRA from before that's been accumulating money in the meantime. But because of the advantages of this and that I'll only have access to it for the time that I'm a graduate student, I've just been prioritizing anything that I'm saving for retirement into this account.
Absolutely. And I do want to point people to season 17, episode 9, my interview with Dr. Corwin Olson. So he and I had a long discussion in that episode about what you were just mentioning, how sometimes contributing to a traditional retirement account, even when you're in graduate school or a fairly low tax bracket, makes sense in certain situations. It's still not something that I'm going to say is my number one best thing to do. I still firmly believe in the Roth IRA for most people who are going to expect that higher marginal income tax bracket in retirement. But certainly, like we talked about with Corwin, like people who are planning on retiring early have to do a lot different kinds of considerations about filling up like the standard deduction aspect of their income and the 10% bracket and the 12% bracket and so forth. So it's kind of a different calculation. But I appreciate you bringing that to light again. And yeah, why this could be certainly a legitimate choice even for a graduate student.
Yeah, and as far as I understand too, the fact that I have a Roth IRA from before actually pairs well with this because, I could withdraw from the 457B up to the standard deduction or up to the 10% tax bracket. And then if I'm still spending money beyond that, withdraw from the Roth IRA without owing any extra taxes.
Absolutely correct. Yeah. That's one of the reasons why I say that it's great to have both traditional and Roth money available to you when you get to retirement so that you can do that kind of tax optimization. And we're even talking about pre-standard retirement age in the case of the 457 that you would have access to it, as you said, as long as you separated from your employer. So that's a really exciting account to use. As you kind of mentioned early on, you do have to be an employee of your institution to have access to this. So like you mentioned, your first year you were on fellowship. I'm suspecting this letter came after you transitioned over to an employee type position. So for those listeners, for those listening, if you are an employee, then certainly this is something to check into. I would hazard a guess that large public universities, part of state systems like the one that you're at, are more likely to offer this kind of benefit than private universities, or it might depend on your state as well. Like maybe some state systems do, some don't. But I have heard of this for, certain employees at large public institutions.
Yeah, my understanding is that it's more of a benefit of public universities. So you wouldn't find it everywhere. And some universities might just not offer it, but worth looking into if you're employed by a public university.
Absolutely. Before I ask you my final standard question, I was just wondering, with all these strategies you've been using over the past 5-6 years, what's been the effect? Like, you've mentioned numbers here and there, but like, have you significantly increased your income or your net worth or reduced your stress, or like what has been the effect of actually employing these strategies? And I guess also the cost, like how much time do you spend on these kinds of activities?
Overall, the result of these has been, thousands of dollars that I've saved up. And because any extra money that I'm saving up, I'm putting into retirement accounts, that'll continue to compound. So, $1,000 saved now will be even more thousands of dollars at retirement age. So it's really kind of had a snowballing effect where just a little bit saved results in making it easier to save more money, which will result in more money with investments further down the road. So I found it to be definitely worth pursuing. My net worth has definitely increased quite a bit in graduate school, although part of that was having a Roth IRA from even before I'd started graduate school. And like you said about benefits to stress and well-being, I think that's a very strong part of it as well. By having enough of an emergency fund saved up that you can do these sorts of strategies and have money to contribute for 529s or bank bonuses or whatnot. And having enough extra money like that beyond your monthly living expenses is really a source of stress relief. It's nice to know that if something unexpected comes up, I'm not going to be unable to pay my bills that month. And there's circumstances where, for instance, at one point in graduate school, both my parents injured themselves within a few days of each other, and I flew out to help take care of them. And, having enough money that you can just book a last minute flight without having to, be unable to pay your bills is really a source of stress relief.
About the cost question, like how much time would you say you spend doing this stuff, like per week or per month?
Really not that much, I would say. A lot of these things, especially over time, I've gotten better at optimizing. Um, in terms of like contributing to a 529 plan and stuff like that. Once you've got it set up, it just takes a few minutes to say, transfer $1,000 into this account and then just put a reminder on your calendar to do taking it out next week. So some of these are pretty low effort. I would say that the bank bonuses and credit card bonuses take a lot more time. And that's something that I've not been doing as much lately, especially as I'm trying to finish up my dissertation. Um, but it's something that, was a nice extra source of cash here and there. And you can kind of devote time flexibly to it depending on if you've got extra time to look up if there's any good sign up bonuses right now. But then since you're not depending on that income, if you don't have the time or don't want to deal with it, then you don't have to.
Yes. Oh, such a wonderful position to be in. Thank you so much for sharing all of the things that you've learned and tried out and, found what works and what didn't for you over the course of your time in graduate school. This is really amazing. I really hope the listener is going to take away at least one thing to experiment with. So let's wrap up with my final question that I ask of all my guests, which is, what is your best financial advice for another early career PhD? And it could be something that we've touched on in the interview already, or it could be something completely new.
Yeah, if I had to sum up everything that we've touched on in this interview, it's that things that are small amounts of money here and there and just a few percent of recurring things really add up over time. That by saving a few percent off your living expenses, having your emergency fund earn a few extra percent per year, saving a few percent on your taxes for money that's going to grow a few percent every year until you retire. These things, when combined, really start to add up and let you get to a place where you have enough money that you have more financial stability and more flexibility to do the things you want. And really, a lot of it comes from having enough of an emergency fund saved up that you can do these sorts of strategies. So especially anything that you can do to save up extra chunks of change if you don't have an emergency fund. And then once you get to the point where you got 4 or 5 months of your living expenses saved up in the bank, you can start to play around with some of these other strategies to let that money snowball.
Wonderful. I love it. Thank you so much, Kyle, for volunteering to come on the podcast.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me.
Listeners, thank you for joining me for this episode. I have a gift for you. You know that final question I ask of all my guests regarding their best financial advice? My team has collected short summaries of all the answers ever given on the podcast into a document that is updated with each new episode release. You can gain access to it by registering for my mailing list at pfforphds.com/advice. Would you like to access transcripts or videos of each episode? I link the show notes for each episode from pfforphds.com/podcast. See you in the next episode. And remember, you don't have to have a PhD to succeed with personal finance, but it helps. Nothing you hear on this podcast should be taken as financial, tax, or legal advice for any individual. The music is Stages of Awakening by Poddington Bear from the Free Music Archive and is shared under CC by NC. Podcast editing by me and show notes creation by Dr. Jill Hoffman.